James Carter, a 72-year-old black veteran, walked slowly into a fancy restaurant in Mississippi. He had served in the military for over 30 years, protecting his country with pride. Now retired, he wanted nothing more than to enjoy a quiet meal. He adjusted his old veteran's cap and smiled at the smell of delicious food in the air. The restaurant was bright and elegant. White tablecloths covered each table, and chandeliers hung from the ceiling, giving the place a golden glow. Soft music played in the background as well-dressed customers sipped their drinks and enjoyed their meals. James felt a little out of place in his simple clothes, but he had been to many restaurants before. He knew he had every right to be there. As he stepped forward, a young restaurant manager, Brad, walked up to him. Brad was in his late 20s, tall, with slicked back hair and a sharp suit. He looked James up and down with a frown. "Can I help you?" Brad asked, his voice cold. "Yes, I'd like a table for one, please," James said politely. Brad smirked. "Are you sure? This place is expensive." James raised an eyebrow. He had been to much fancier places. Money wasn't an issue. He had worked hard all his life. He didn't like the way Brad spoke to him, but he stayed calm. "Yes, I'm sure," James replied. Brad sighed and shook his head. "I think you'd be more comfortable somewhere else," he said. James felt his heart sink. "Somewhere else?" He asked. "Why can't I eat here?" Brad crossed his arms. "Look, I don't want to argue. This restaurant has a certain standard. I just don't think you belong here." A few people at nearby tables overheard the conversation. Some looked uncomfortable, while others ignored it. No one spoke up. James felt heat rising to his face. He had faced discrimination before, but it still hurt every time. He had fought for this country, risked his life for the people in it, and now he was being told he wasn't good enough to sit in a restaurant. "I served in the U.S. Army for over 3 decades, James said firmly. "I've eaten in places all over the world. I have every right to be here." Brad rolled his eyes. "I don't care where you served," he said. "I make the rules here. And I'm telling you, you need to leave." James clenched his jaw. He knew arguing wouldn't help. People like Brad never listened. He took a deep breath and turned around, his hands shaking with anger and disappointment. As he walked toward the door, a deep, familiar voice echoed through the restaurant. "That's no way to treat a hero." James stopped. The restaurant went silent. All eyes turned to the man who had just spoken. James turned slowly and saw a figure standing up from a table near the back. His heart skipped a beat. It was Morgan Freeman. The famous actor walked toward him, his face serious. The restaurant manager's smirk disappeared. Everyone watched in shock as Morgan Freeman stepped in. Something was about to change. The restaurant fell silent as Morgan Freeman walked toward James Carter. His deep voice had already caught everyone's attention, but now his presence alone seemed to fill the room with an unshakable energy. Brad, the young restaurant manager, swallowed hard. His smug expression faded as Morgan Freeman stopped in front of him. The actor's piercing eyes locked onto him, and for the first time that evening, Brad looked unsure of himself. "Do you know who this man is?" Morgan asked calmly, nodding toward James. Brad hesitated. No," he muttered. "This man is a veteran, a soldier who fought for this country, for your freedom, for mine, for everyone in this room." Morgan continued, his voice steady. "And you just disrespected him." James looked down, his hands still trembling from the humiliation. He had experienced discrimination before, but it never got easier. The sting of being told he wasn't welcome still burned in his chest. He wanted to leave, to avoid making a scene, but something about Morgan Freeman's presence kept him rooted to the spot. Brad shifted uncomfortably. He tried to regain his confidence. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it," he said, forcing a laugh. "I was just saying that." "You were just saying he doesn't belong," Morgan interrupted. His voice was calm but firm, filled with authority. "And I'm telling you, you're wrong. A murmur spread through the restaurant. Some diners looked embarrassed for staying silent earlier. Others leaned forward, waiting to see what would happen next. Brad's face turned red. "Mr. Freeman, with all due respect, this is my restaurant. I have the right to decide who we serve." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Your restaurant? Do you own this place?" Brad opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't own the restaurant. He was just a manager. The real owner wasn't even there. "I run things here," Brad said weakly. Morgan let out a small chuckle. "Well, you're certainly running them the wrong way." James cleared his throat. He had been silent, letting Morgan speak for him, but now he found his voice. "Young man," he said, looking Brad in the eye, "I have been through more than you can imagine. I have seen war, I have lost friends, and I have fought for people I didn't even know. And yet after all that, I still come home to this." Brad looked away, his confidence crumbling. Morgan nodded at James, then turned back to the other diners. "And the rest of you," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "How many of you heard this man being mistreated? How many of you looked away?" The customers looked down at their plates, ashamed. No one had spoken up when Brad humiliated James. Some had even watched with curiosity, as if it were entertainment. An older couple near the window suddenly stood up. "We're sorry," the man said. "We should have said something." His wife nodded, looking at James with regret in her eyes. One by one, a few others spoke up. "This isn't right," a woman said. "He should be treated with respect." Brad's face paled. He had lost control of the situation. What had started as a small act of discrimination had now turned into a public disgrace. Morgan turned back to James. "Sir, you deserve better," he said. "And I think it's time someone makes this right." Before James could respond, the restaurant doors swung open. A tall man in a suit walked in, looking confused at the sight before him. It was the real owner of the restaurant. Someone had called him, and he was about to find out what was going on. The restaurant's front doors swung open, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the tense atmosphere. He was Mr. Daniels, the owner of the restaurant. Someone must have called him about the situation, and from the look on his face, he wasn't happy. The diners turned toward him, whispering among themselves. The room, which had been filled with tension just moments ago, now felt even heavier. Brad, the young manager, straightened his tie and quickly walked up to Mr. Daniels. "Sir," he said nervously, forcing a smile, "there was a small misunderstanding, but I have everything under control." Mr. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, "because from what I just heard outside, it doesn't sound like a misunderstanding. It sounds like a disaster." Brad swallowed hard. "Well, you see," he started, but before he could continue, Morgan Freeman stepped forward. "Mr. Daniels," Morgan said, his voice calm but firm, "I think you should hear what really happened." Mr. Daniels turned toward Morgan, his expression shifting from frustration to surprise. He hadn't realized the famous actor was in his restaurant. "Mr. Freeman," he said, nodding with respect, "I'm listening." Morgan gestured toward James Carter, who still stood near the entrance, his veteran's cap slightly tilted on his head. "This man, James Carter, is a veteran," Morgan explained. "He walked in here tonight, hoping for a good meal. Instead, your manager, Brad, humiliated him and told him he wasn't welcome." Mr. Daniels' eyes widened in shock. He turned to James. "Is this true?" James nodded slowly. "I came here to eat," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I've served this country for over 30 years. I've been through war and sacrificed more than I can explain. But tonight, I was treated like I didn't belong." The room was silent. The weight of James's words hung in the air. Mr. Daniels looked around at the other diners. "Did anyone else see this happen?" he asked. A few customers hesitated before speaking up. "Yes," a woman said softly. "I saw it. It wasn't right." A man near the back nodded. Brad turned him away for no reason. We should have spoken up sooner. Mr. Daniels took a deep breath and turned back to his manager. Brad, he said firmly, is this how you treat customers? Brad's face was pale. He glanced around the room, realizing that no one was on his side. I didn't mean anything by it, he stammered. I was just trying to keep the restaurant's reputation. Mr. Daniels cut him off. And you thought turning away a war hero would help our reputation? His voice was sharp with disappointment. Brad had no answer. He lowered his head. Mr. Daniels shook his head and sighed. Then he turned back to James. Mr. Carter, I want to sincerely apologize for what happened here tonight, he said. This is not how we treat people in my restaurant. James looked at him, searching for sincerity in his words. He could see the regret in Mr. Daniels' eyes. To make this right, Mr. Daniels continued, I'd like to personally invite you to stay. Your meal tonight is on the house. And as for Brad, he turned toward the young manager, his expression turning cold. You're fired. A gasp spread through the room. Brad's mouth fell open. What? He choked out. You heard me, Mr. Daniels said. I will not have someone like you representing my restaurant. You disrespected a customer, a veteran, and embarrassed this business. Brad tried to argue, but it was no use. Security stepped forward, and with his face burning in shame, he walked toward the exit. James, still standing in shock, felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Morgan Freeman smiling at him. Looks like justice was served tonight, Morgan said with a wink. For the first time that evening, James smiled. James Carter stood still for a moment, processing everything that had just happened. The man who had humiliated him, who had treated him as if he didn't belong, was now gone. Justice had been served. But even with Brad fired, James still felt the sting of what had happened. Mr. Daniels, the restaurant owner, turned back to James with a serious expression. Mr. Carter, he said, his voice respectful. I know that firing Brad doesn't erase what happened tonight. I want to do more. Please, let me make this right. James looked at him, curious. And how do you plan to do that? He asked. Mr. Daniels took a deep breath, then turned to face the entire restaurant. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice carrying across the room. Tonight, something unacceptable happened in my restaurant. A man who gave his life to serve this country was mistreated here by someone who worked for me. The room remained silent. Every eye was on Mr. Daniels. This should never have happened, he continued, and I take full responsibility. Mr. Carter, on behalf of my restaurant and staff, I deeply apologize for the way you were treated. I want you to know that you are always welcome here, and I hope you will allow us to serve you the meal you deserve. A quiet murmur spread through the diners. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked guilty for not speaking up earlier. James folded his arms, thinking. He wasn't someone who needed fancy words, but the way Mr. Daniels spoke, it sounded honest. Still, words alone weren't enough. That's a good speech, James said finally. But respect isn't just about words. It's about actions. Mr. Daniels nodded. I agree, he said. That's why, from this day forward, I'm going to make sure this restaurant treats every customer with the dignity they deserve. I'll be training my staff to respect all guests, no matter who they are. James studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. Morgan Freeman, who had been quietly watching, smiled. That sounds like a step in the right direction, he said. Mr. Daniels gestured toward a table near the front of the restaurant. Please, Mr. Carter, allow us to serve you tonight. It would be an honor. James hesitated. Part of him still wanted to leave, but another part of him wanted to prove a point. He did belong here, and no one could tell him otherwise. He took a deep breath and nodded. All right, he said. I'll stay. A wave of relief washed over the restaurant. As James walked toward the table, Morgan Freeman walked beside him. "I hope you don't mind some company," Morgan said with a grin. James chuckled. "Not at all," he said. The moment James sat down, the restaurant came back to life. Waiters hurried over with menus, treating him with the respect he should have received from the start. Customers whispered among themselves, still in awe of what had happened. As James looked around, he realized something. This wasn't just about him. What happened tonight was bigger than one meal. It was about standing up for what was right. He picked up the menu and smiled. "I think I'll have the steak," he said. Morgan laughed. "Good choice," he said. "And don't worry, I'll make sure they cook it just right." For the first time that evening, James felt truly welcome, and as he enjoyed his meal, he knew one thing for sure. Tonight, something had changed. James Carter sat at the table, still trying to take everything in. Just moments ago, he had been humiliated and told to leave. Now he was being treated like an honored guest. The change felt almost unreal. A waiter rushed over, placing a glass of cold water in front of James. "Sir, it is an honor to serve you," he said with a respectful nod. "Your meal is on the house tonight." James gave a small smile. "Thank you," he said. Morgan Freeman, sitting across from him, leaned back in his chair. "I hope you're hungry," he said with a chuckle, "because after tonight, I have a feeling this restaurant is going to make sure you have the best meal of your life." James laughed softly. "I sure hope so." The waiter returned a few moments later with a plate of food, a perfectly cooked steak, buttery mashed potatoes, and fresh vegetables. The smell alone made James' stomach rumble. Morgan nodded approvingly. "Now that's a meal fit for a hero." James picked up his fork and took a bite. The steak was tender, seasoned just right. He had to admit, it was one of the best meals he'd had in a long time. As he ate, a few customers approached the table. An older couple stopped beside him. The man, wearing a navy blue blazer, cleared his throat. "Sir, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not speaking up earlier. What happened to you wasn't right." James looked up and saw the sincerity in the man's eyes. He nodded. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. The woman beside him placed a gentle hand on James' shoulder. "And thank you for your service," she said warmly. More people came forward, some to shake his hand, some to apologize, and some just to show their support. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. James had spent most of his life fighting for his country, yet he had often felt invisible when he came home. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Mr. Daniels, the restaurant owner, walked over again, looking determined. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about respect being more than just words. You were right." James raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Mr. Daniels nodded. "I don't just want to make things right for you. I want to do something bigger. I want to start a tradition here at my restaurant. From now on, every month, we will host a special dinner honoring our veterans. Any veteran who walks through these doors will eat for free." The restaurant went silent for a moment. Then someone clapped. Soon, more people joined in. It wasn't just a meal. It was a statement. James looked at Mr. Daniels, impressed. "That's a good start," he said with a smile. Morgan grinned. "I'd say it's more than that. It's the beginning of something great." James finished his meal, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the food. Tonight had started with humiliation, but it was ending with hope. As he stood up to leave, Morgan placed a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Carter, it was an honor to share this meal with you," he said. James smiled. "The honor was mine." As he stepped out of the restaurant, the night air felt different, lighter. He had walked in feeling like he didn't belong, but he was leaving with his head held high. Tonight, something had changed, not just for him, but for everyone in that restaurant. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of a much bigger change in the world. As James Carter walked out of the restaurant, he felt different. Something inside him had shifted. For years, he had carried the weight of feeling invisible, as if his sacrifices had been forgotten. But tonight, things had changed. People had finally seen him, not just as an old man, but as a veteran, a human being who deserved respect. Morgan Freeman walked beside him, hands in his pockets. "James," he said, glancing at him with a smile, "I don't think this is the last time you'll hear about tonight." James chuckled. "You think so?" Morgan nodded. "Trust me, moments like this don't just disappear. They inspire people." And he was right. By the next morning, a customer who had been at the restaurant had posted the entire story online. The post described how a rude manager had kicked out a black veteran, how Morgan Freeman had stepped in, and how justice had been served. Within hours, the post went viral. Thousands of people shared it, commenting on how powerful the moment was. Some people were furious that James had been treated that way. Others were inspired by how the situation had been handled. Many praised Mr. Daniels for firing Brad and starting a veteran appreciation program. James had no idea any of this was happening. He was sitting in his small apartment, sipping his morning coffee, when his phone rang. It was an old friend, Charles, who had served with him in the military. "James." Charles' voice was full of excitement. "Have you seen the news?" James frowned. "What news?" Charles laughed. "You're all over the internet, my friend. Your story is everywhere." James blinked in confusion. "My story?" Charles quickly explained. "Someone recorded what happened at that restaurant. People are talking about it. News stations are picking it up. You're a hero, James." James set his coffee down. He wasn't sure what to think. He had spent years trying to live quietly, never expecting the world to notice him. And now, all of a sudden, his name was everywhere. Before he could process it, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. Hesitantly, he answered. "Mr. Carter." A warm voice spoke on the other end. "My name is Angela Reed. I'm a reporter with a national news station. I would love to interview you about what happened last night." James rubbed his forehead. "I don't know," he said slowly. "I'm not looking for attention." Angela chuckled. "I understand. But this isn't just about you. Your story is making a difference. People are talking about how we should treat our veterans better. You have a voice, Mr. Carter. Maybe it's time to use it." James was silent for a moment. He had spent his life serving his country, but maybe there was another way to serve, by speaking up, by making sure no veteran ever felt the way he did last night. He took a deep breath. "All right," he said finally. "Let's do it." By that evening, James was on national television. Sitting across from Angela Reed in a studio, he shared his experience, not just about the restaurant, but about all the struggles veterans faced after coming home. He spoke about the lack of respect, the difficulties they endured, and how small acts of kindness could change everything. As millions watched, something incredible happened. People all over the country started talking about how they could help veterans in their communities. Restaurants began offering discounts and free meals to veterans. Businesses started hiring more former soldiers. James had walked into a restaurant just looking for a meal. Instead, he had started a movement. James Carter never expected his story to spread so far. What started as a bad experience at a restaurant had turned into a nationwide conversation. People were talking about veterans, about respect, and about how small actions could create big change. As James sat in his apartment, his phone kept ringing. Strangers, reporters, and even military organizations wanted to speak with him. It was overwhelming, but James knew this was bigger than him. A knock on his door made him pause. He wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, he got up and opened it. To his surprise, Mr. Daniels, the restaurant owner, stood outside. "Mr. Carter," he said with a smile, "I hope I'm not bothering you." James shook his head. "Not at all. Come in." Mr. Daniels stepped inside, looking around the small but cozy apartment. He took a deep breath. "I wanted to see you in person," he said. "After everything that happened, I've been thinking a lot. James raised an eyebrow. About what? Mr. Daniels sat down across from him. That night changed me, he admitted. I thought I was running a good business, but I wasn't paying attention to the way my staff treated people. You opened my eyes. James listened quietly as Mr. Daniels continued. I don't just want to do one Veterans Night a month at my restaurant, he said. I want to do more. I've been reaching out to other restaurant owners, and they want to join me. We're starting something big, a program where veterans can eat for free in restaurants across the country. James sat back, surprised. That's incredible. Mr. Daniels smiled. And it's because of you. Because you spoke up. I know you never wanted attention, but your story is helping people. James nodded slowly. He had never thought of himself as someone who could make a difference, but now it was clear he already had. Just then, James' phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and froze. Everything okay? Mr. Daniels asked. James swallowed hard. It's the White House, he said. Mr. Daniels' eyes widened. The White House. James took a deep breath and answered. Mr. Carter. A strong voice spoke on the other end. This is an official invitation from the President of the United States. We would love to honor you for your service and your impact. Would you be willing to come to Washington, D.C.? James' hands shook slightly. He had served his country for years, but no one had ever invited him to the White House before. After a moment, he cleared his throat. I'd be honored, he said. A week later, James stood in a grand hall in Washington, D.C. The room was filled with veterans, government officials, and journalists. The president himself walked onto the stage, smiling warmly. Ladies and gentlemen, the president began, tonight, we honor a man whose story has reminded us of something important. Respect should never be a privilege. It should be a right. The crowd clapped as the president continued. James Carter has not only served this country with courage, but he has also helped start a movement that will ensure no veteran is ever treated as less than they deserve. James felt a lump in his throat as the president turned to him. Mr. Carter, on behalf of this nation, we thank you. The audience stood and clapped. Some veterans in the crowd saluted him. James, usually a man of few words, simply nodded. As he stood there, he realized something. He had spent years wondering if people cared. Now he had his answer. As James Carter stood in the grand hall of the White House, surrounded by applause, he couldn't help but think about how much had changed in just a few days. One moment, he was a retired veteran being kicked out of a restaurant. The next, he was standing before the President of the United States, being honored for his service and his impact on the country. When the applause settled, the President stepped forward and shook James' hand firmly. Mr. Carter, he said, you remind us that one voice can make a difference. Because of you, people are treating veterans with the respect they deserve. James nodded. I never expected any of this, he admitted. But I'm grateful, not just for me, but for all the veterans out there who have felt forgotten. The president smiled. And we won't forget, he said. That's why, starting today, a new initiative will be launched. More businesses will take part in the Veteran Meal Program, and companies across the country will work harder to support those who have served. James felt a wave of emotion. It was more than he had ever dreamed. After the ceremony, James was invited to a private meeting with government officials. They asked him for his thoughts on what more could be done to help veterans. For the first time, people in power were listening to him. Over the next few months, James' life changed in ways he never imagined. Restaurants across the country joined the program started by Mr. Daniels. Veterans could now eat for free in hundreds of locations. Businesses reached out, offering jobs and resources for former soldiers struggling to adjust to civilian life. James was invited to speak at events, sharing his story. At first, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. He had always been a quiet man, never one for the spotlight. But then he thought about all the veterans who felt invisible, just like he had before that night at the restaurant. So he spoke. He told people about his experiences, about the struggles veterans faced, and about the power of respect. And everywhere he went, people listened. One afternoon, James sat on his porch, enjoying the fresh air. His phone rang, and he smiled when he saw Morgan Freeman's name on the screen. "Mr. Carter," Morgan said with his smooth, familiar voice. "I hear you've been busy." James chuckled. "You could say that." "I just wanted to check in on you," Morgan continued. "You know, when I stepped in that night, I knew something special was happening, but I never imagined it would grow into all this." James nodded. "Neither did I," he admitted, "but I'm glad it did." Morgan paused for a moment, then said, "You've made a real difference, James, and I hope you know, you deserved this respect all along." James took a deep breath. "For the first time, in a long time, I think I do." They talked for a while longer, sharing stories and laughter. By the time James hung up, he felt at peace. Years later, James' story became part of history. Schools taught students about the movement he helped start. His name was remembered, not just as a veteran, but as a man who reminded the world that respect should be given to all, no matter their age, race, or background. And every time a veteran sat down for a free meal, every time someone spoke up against injustice, James Carter's legacy lived on. Because one man's voice had changed everything.